I'm Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We're executive directors of the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Our guest today will be Dr. Anthea Butler, a contributor to the 1619 Project and author of White Evangelical Racism.
The Freedom from Religion Foundation, which produces Freethought Matters, is the nation's largest association of free thinkers. That's atheists, agnostics, and other non-believers. We invite you to join us in our vital work to keep our secular government free from religious influence. Become a member at ffrf.org or ask for a complimentary copy of our newspaper, Freethought Today. Freedom depends on freethinkers. Watch prior episodes of Freethought Matters on FFRF's YouTube channel.
Our guest today is Professor Anthea Butler. She's the chair of the Department of Religious Studies and the Geraldine R. Siegel Professor of American Social Thought at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Butler is a contributor to the 1619 Project and the author of Women in the Church of God in Christ, Making a Sanctified World. Her most recent book, and the topic of our show today, is White Evangelical Racism, the Politics of Morality in America.
Dr. Butler is also a contributing author to the seminal report on white Christian nationalism that was produced by the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. And we're delighted she's agreed to appear at FFRF's upcoming national convention at the end of October in San Antonio, where she'll receive a Champion of the First Amendment Award. Thank you, Professor Butler, for being part of the report on Christian nationalism at the January 6th insurrection and for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're really making an impact, your work and your writings. I'd like to start by quoting from your book, White Evangelical Racism. You write, "Racism is a feature, not a bug, of American evangelicalism, from using the Bible to support slavery to opposing the civil rights movement, integration, and interracial marriage. Evangelicals have long employed a presumed moral authority to hide their prejudices." Tell us more about that paragraph.
Well, that paragraph actually was born out of a 20-plus year long frustration. And that frustration was basically trying to think about why was it that evangelicals were always trying to influence society, but at the same time having such harsh things to say about African Americans and other people of color, first of all. And then secondarily, why that the press and others really believed evangelicals about everything that they said, that they couldn't really see past the kinds of moral suasion arguments that they had used in order to get power. And so that sentence pretty much encapsulates everything I thought that I needed to do in the book, that racism is a feature and not a bug. It is something that drives American evangelicalism, and it's something that controls the way in which they think about morality and power and how it's used to, basically take away the rights of others in American society.
Well, Jerry Falwell said they were the moral majority. Did the media just take them at their word for that?
They did. And I can't stray that high enough to say, basically, when Jerry Falwell said that, it was a kind of time where people thought, well, yes, they're sincere, they're moral. Look, they want to talk about the family. They want to talk about all these things that are ills of society. But the fact of the matter is, it was religion for thee and not for me. Mm-hmm. Or in other words, what I like to say is, the rules are for you and not for them. They are rules in which to control you, control the society, control the things that they want to have happen. It wasn't really about morality at all, but people took them at their word.
So in your book, you indict the evangelical church in America, and by the way, I used to be an evangelical minister, so I'm kind of shaking here. You indict the evangelical church in America for supporting the status quo, and you point out that it supported, historically, it supported slavery, it supported segregation. Does the current evangelical community have any desire to honestly examine its past, or even its present for that matter?
Well, this is a complicated question because evangelicals have tried to examine it. They tried to examine it through, I think, racial reconciliation movements, but these only go to a point. They're not willing to do the deep excavation of the motivations and the results of the ways in which their practices have influenced and affected the racist parts of American society. And so when I say that, what I mean is, they have been a part of this. They have other kind of a narrative too about, being abolitionists and others. But that narrative tends to be the one that is always put forward as a way to absolve evangelicals from their complicity in the bad things that have happened in America.
Well, in your book, you quote, for example, Frederick Douglass, observing that for all the slaveholders I have ever met, religious slaveholders are the worst. The Southern Baptists broke off from its denomination explicitly to support slavery, and in your book you note that they didn't even apologize for slaveholding until 1995. So can you talk more about that history, and I think the fact that many people in the public don't realize that history?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big history. In the 19th century, you have several groups of denominations that break apart. The Southern Baptists are one, the Presbyterians are another, the Methodist Church breaks apart. And all of these are over the issue of slavery and slaveholding. So in the case of the Southern Baptist Convention, part of what was happening there is that they broke away from the Northern Baptists, who are the American Baptists. There's lots of different flavors of Baptists in this country, so we won't even get into that. But to just make it clean, to understand that this Southern Baptist Convention, which has recently had the problems with, sex abuse and trying to hide all of that, the kinds of things that they have been trying to take over the convention with the very conservative faction, all of these things really stem from the 19th century and this slaveholding kind of information and things that they wanted to put forward. So I think what we have to look at when we think about denominationalism in the United States and explicitly evangelicalism is that they've all had to contend with race in some kind of way, whether that was through slavery, whether that was through the civil rights movement, or, right now since 2008 with the election of Barack Obama as president, and in 2016 and 2020 with the strong evangelical support for Trump, white evangelicals, and specifically Southern Baptists in particular, have been very much on the side of conservative religion and conservative ideals and morals that have pushed forward a kind of segregation, whether it was through Jim Crow or through the kinds of segregation that happens because of wage earning and policies about prison and other things, and especially the way that they've treated gender when we think about pro-life versus, pro-choice.
So you note in your book, you kind of give a whole history of the evangelical movement, and you note that I think it was 1995 that the Southern Baptists apologized for slavery, but I know that you had some critiques of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what these apologies do are two things. One is they're very much a part of a PR campaign. We are apologizing for racism. There are these racial reconciliation campaigns like the Southern Baptists and others that have hope to strive to change the ways in which people think about them in the public, okay? But these statements don't have heft, because what you see happening afterwards is that they're back in the same kind of policies that are racial policies. So if we want to bring this forward from 1995, what is the biggest thing that Southern Baptists are talking about right now? Critical race theory. That is a way to stop talking about the teaching of race and the effects of race in American politics and in American history. So when you do that, what is the point of making a statement when you were just going back to the same racist stuff you did before?
Yeah, it's like saying, oh, look over here, don't look over there.
Exactly.
Window dressing. So you also write that in America, evangelicalism is synonymous with whiteness. How so?
Yeah, I think that and this is something that's been very prevalent to me since the 1/6 insurrection, is that there's a sense in which Christianity, and specifically Protestant Christianity in America, is thought of as white. In other words, something that either makes you white or you as a white person believe in, or as a person of color who comes into it, you become white in a certain kind of way. And I talk about this in the book through the issue of colorblindness and how these kinds of practices start in the late 1960s towards the, what we thought was the end of the civil rights movement, but it's still a civil rights movement, right? So we think about this, and then the ways in which whiteness gets ascribed to Christianity. I tell a story about how a couple in Mississippi interracial couple in Mississippi wanted to get married at a particular venue, and the owner tells them, "Oh no, we only serve white Christians here." And I'm like, how do you say something like this unless you identify Christianity as being a specifically white kind of religion, or the practices in which white people who are evangelical ascribe to that makes you everybody okay?
Well, when we see Sunday school pictures, portraits of Jesus, isn't he invariably white too?
Yeah, exactly. And so when you don't see that, or you see these biblical stories that depicted Caucasian people, what are you supposed to think? What is a child supposed to think? Christianity gets synonymous with whiteness. For a lot of white supremacist groups, this is the same thing. Even though they might not be explicitly Christian, they use Christian ideals in order to promote anti-race, theologies and beliefs. And so I think what we have to do is really take a look at the kind of work that whiteness is doing in evangelicalism to support certain kinds of behaviors and beliefs that cut out other people, honestly.
Well, when I was an evangelical minister, I never thought about any of that. To me, the word evangelical meant the good news, which is what the word actually means. Aren't there black evangelical churches?
Yes, there are. And they're Black evangelicals, they're Latino evangelicals, they're Asian American evangelicals. Yes, absolutely. But what I'm talking about in this book is both sort of a way in which people look, it might be one way, but in another way to talk about the practice of whitening evangelicalism. In other words, it's the ways in which all of these groups are asked to have certain kinds of behaviors and beliefs that are held by the majority group of white evangelicals, and they have to give up something of their own culture to do that. And I think that's really important to understand. So when you heard the word evangelical, just like me, you think good news, right? But unfortunately, for a lot of different groups, the good news means you got to sing a certain kind of praise and worship music. The good news means that you can't do your cultural practices the way you might in terms of worship, in terms of belief. The other thing that means is that you can't be part of movements that are about racial justice. So, for instance, let's talk about the ways in which evangelicals talk about Black Lives Matter. They think it's a terrorist group. They think it's this or that or the other. And the problem with that is that why wouldn't you as an evangelical want to see less Black people being killed and respect for African Americans? That seems to be very straightforward to me. But for evangelicals, they racialize this and saying being in Black Lives Matter is akin to being Antifa or all these other kinds of political beliefs. And so what you see is a conflation of the politics alongside the religious beliefs. And a lot of times the political beliefs that are conservative overarch and take over the kinds of beliefs that evangelicals should have, that, the gospel is open to all of those kinds of things that they say, but they don't quite do.
Of course, the history of the black churches in America come from the slave owners forcing Christianity, forcing this foreign religion upon them. Isn't that part of the whole history of the church?
Yes, it is. And part of that is also about the Black church. And I talk about this in the 1619 chapter that I have on Black church, about the ways in which the Black church had to fight for the democratic process. That was part and parcel of the way that they had to be in the United States in order to have not just a right to worship on their own, but the freedom to be who they needed to be, to work and live where they needed to work, to be a part of the democratic process. And so when you look at things like voting rights being taken away and, Southern Baptists and others, aligning themselves with politicians who don't want you to be able to vote, I have to think that these kinds of racial politics have turned, evangelicals, especially white evangelicals, against other evangelicals of color.
So before we take our break, I do want to get to a big point of your book, which is the entanglement between the Republican Party and evangelicalism. And you've pointed out that that it's become a political movement as well. Could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I think one of the things that happens in the 70s forward is that for evangelicals, this, flirting with the political process, and especially I kind of ascribe that to the beginning of the 1950s and Billy Graham, this flirting with politics and conservative politics, what ends up happening is that they get used as a very big foil for the Republican Party. So when the Republican Party tries to mobilize their voting, especially if we start to think about Ronald Reagan, then evangelicals and the Republican Party form an alliance. And that alliance isn't just through churches. That alliance is through organizations that become lobbying organizations on Capitol Hill. So I think one of the important things I try to bring out a little bit in my book is to talk about how organizations like Focus on the Family, Family Research Council, American Family Association, and a myriad of other evangelical religious organizations not only raise funds and now can be considered as a church in case nobody's paying attention, but they also can be lobbyists. And they lobby for things on Capitol Hill. They lobby for things in state and local governments. And they are a very potent force in putting forth the kinds of moral issues like, abortion that they want to see change in America. I mean, I think we can see this very clearly with the recent SCOTUS decision. That was a 50-plus year project. That project, they have won. And so now everyone else is sitting there going, how could this happen? And I'm like, some of us have been watching this for a long time. You did not pay attention.
So let's pay attention. I think that's what your book is arguing. Let's do pay attention. In your book, you, and of course other people have pointed this out as well, that evangelicals, you say, have lost interest in decency, and that a religious tradition called by grace became defined by resentment. That certainly looks like that is what happened when they embraced Trump, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely true. But I would say this even started before Trump. It really actually started in 2008, 2007 with the presidential campaign of Barack Obama. This became a big moment for evangelicals because they said that this was going to be the end of the world as you knew it. But what it also was the beginning of an African-American man running and then winning the presidency. And so that took everything away from the sort of white male-led kind of norms that evangelicals were used to and promoted in the kinds of ways that they taught scripture. So I think for them, this going towards Trump was about this resentment and backlash to the 2008 and 2012 election cycle. And I always use this as a very big point to sort of remind people how things got for evangelicals. In 2012, there was a lot of pushback at first to Mitt Romney. But by October of 2012, right before the election, Mormonism was taken off the cult list of the Billy Graham Evangelical Association. Now, if you can make the Billy Graham Evangelical Association begin to think that Mormonism is okay just because a white man is running for president and you hope he's going to beat the black guy, then I ask you, what are the policies about evangelicals that have made them turn this way and made them go after somebody like Donald Trump? They didn't care.
Excellent.
They wanted to have a white man in power.
We're talking with Anthea Butler, a contributor to the 1619 Project and author of White Evangelical Racism. And when we come back, well, we have an awful lot to talk about. We're going to ask you a little bit more about your personal views and what the connection is between white Christian nationalism and the January 6th insurrection.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist.
When I first recorded that commercial back in 2014, being openly atheist in America was still fairly uncommon. Today, the fastest growing religious group in the country is the non-religious, especially among the young. That progress is heartening, but the religious pushback is fierce and the forces of Christian nationalism are well organized. Our progress won't continue unless we work together so that reason and our secular constitution will prevail. That's why I'm asking you to join the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics working to keep state and church separate, just like our founders intended. Please join the Freedom from Religion Foundation today. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
We're continuing our conversation with Anthea Butler, author of White Evangelical Racism. So, Professor Butler, may we ask what your religious background is? Were you ever an evangelical?
I was for a time. I was baptized and raised Catholic, went evangelical for a little while, went to evangelical seminary, Fuller Seminary. And then when I started my PhD program, I decided that this was not the path for me anymore. And I identify as Catholic, but as I like to tell people, I'm pretty much always fighting everything, always.
I visited Fuller Seminary a few times back in the 1970s.
Yeah.
So in your book, you write that evangelicalism is at a precipice. It's no longer a movement to which American Christians look for a moral center. Evangelicalism, you say, embraces racists and says that evangelicals' interests, and only theirs, are those that are most important for all American citizens. What more does the white evangelical movement have in store for this nation? What do we have to look forward to?
Honestly, full-on authoritarianism if you let them continue. I mean, I think that it's very clear with the decision of SCOTUS, the recent ruling on Vermont schools and vouchers, the recent prayer ruling as well of the coach who was blatantly praying on front of the field, and they ruled against the school district that fired him. I think what you can expect is a lot more hell, to put it bluntly. And I think that you can look at a full-on assault on trans rights, a full-on assault of gay marriage, and pretty much anything else they can gobble up if they have the opportunity. And they do have the opportunity because they have the courts. And I think one of the things that, people should be kicking themselves in the can about is that we did not pay attention to what evangelicals were thinking about and doing when they were stacking the courts, when they were up for Trump, when they were putting a concerted effort to all of these things that would undermine American democracy.
Well, we were thinking about it, but not enough people were they?
No, they were not.
So we haven't really talked about the January 6th insurrection and the evidence of white Christian nationalism. And you did a chapter for the report that we issued, but briefly, is this what you see in store for us, more of this?
Absolutely, I do. I mean, I think the hearings, the January 6th hearings have been very good. What they haven't touched on yet is the role of religion in the ways in which that got organized. I mean, before 1/6, you had several prayer meetings, a big Jericho march in D.C. in December of 2020, the morning of January 6th. Who opened up the prayer for the speech that Trump gave? It was Paula White. These people were egged on by, a kind of a religious fervor, in addition to the kinds of nationalism and the stop the steal lie. So I think what we have to think about now is how these kinds of forces, evangelical forces, alongside with conspiracy theorists like QAnon, are making a very dangerous kind of religious stew here in America that may, ultimately and could ultimately take down the democratic process in this nation.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think things are getting very critical, but we want to leave the viewers with some hope or some guidance about what we can do to ensure this doesn't happen. So what would you suggest?
I would suggest a couple of things. First of all, you need to get involved in your community where you see these kinds of candidates being on the school board, the kinds of candidates that are running for local and state offices, contribute to campaigns that are not doing this, first of all. And then secondarily, on the national level, I think you need to let your congresspeople and your senators hear from you. You have to do that. And the third and most important thing is to continue to help people fight for voting rights. Voting rights are being eroded, and groups like Mark Elias's group and others that are working, and NAACP and others who are working on voting rights, becoming a very important part of what is happening. And then lastly, but most importantly during this time, support the women, the trans people, and the people who are LGBTQI, who are, at peril from evangelicals who wish to destroy their lives and want them to have less of autonomy and rights over their own bodies. I think this is a very important part of where we are right now, and I think that's where the next big fight happens.
So in the remaining few minutes we have left, could you briefly outline the 1619 Project and your work for it?
Sure. The 1619 Project evolved from a New York Times Magazine article that was put together by Nicole Hannah-Jones and became a book which basically looks at all of the ways in which African Americans have contributed to the country, why she used 1619 as a starting point instead of what most people talk about as 1776 is that that's when the first slave ships landed here. Now there were African Americans here before that, excuse me, not African Americans, but Africans here in the country before that. But I think what's important about that date, it gives it sort of a way in which to think about the founding of this nation very differently. My particular chapter talks about the role of religion, and specifically the Black church, in the making of America and the fight for civil rights and democracy. And I think one of the things that is really, really important about this book is that it shows the depth to which what people haven't learned, first of all, about the role slavery has played, the role that African Americans have played in this nation, and the absolute violence that has happened in this country to Black people in America. I think one of the things that's really important is that a lot of communities, especially in the South and even in the West and the Midwest, have a lynching story that happened in their community, and those stories have been buried. And so I think what's important about this book is that it puts people into the frame to begin to really think about this history that is not an alternate history of America, as some people like to term it, but a history of America that is just as important as these other kinds of histories that have glorified the nation instead of really taking the nation to account for all the things that have happened.
Yeah. So in about 30 seconds, Anthea, what do you think about reparations?
I think reparations are a very important part of what should have happened in America, and I'm still waiting for my 40 acres and a mule, which should be Alaska by now.
Well, I agree.
Maybe if we tithed every church 10%, we could use that money for reparations, huh?
Yeah, I think at this point, the kind of breakdown and the fracturing we have in America, that we can't even have this conversation about reparations because we need to just basically try to get ourselves back on track to having a full democracy. We don't have one right now, and that is very troubling.
It's a great book, White Evangelical Racism. Thank you so much, Professor Anthea Butler, for joining us today. And I'm looking forward to meeting you in person at FFRF's convention later in the fall.
I'm looking forward to being there.
And thank you for watching Freethought Matters.
Because free thought matters.
Hi, I'm Steve Pinker. In my book, Enlightenment Now, I show that the world has become a better place as reason has been overcoming superstition and tribalism. But the values of the Enlightenment are under attack. That's why I'm a proud member of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest association of free thinkers working to keep state and church separate. Please join me in supporting the Freedom from Religion Foundation to ensure that our government is driven not by religion, but by reason.